So this next video is going to talk about a structure called the cerebrum. And as you'll see in this diagram here, the cerebrum is just part of the brain. There are lots of different regions of the brain. The cerebrum is the one that forms the majority of the area that you see. So this is the cerebrum all the way up the top here. It's broken into 2 hemispheres and 5 lobes, but we'll discuss this later in this video. You can see that other areas of the brain that won't be discussed until later videos are the cerebellum at the back here. We've also got the diencephalon, this area in here. And then we've got the brainstem, this area down here that connects the brain onto the spinal cord. So all of these areas here will be discussed in subsequent videos, and now we're going to focus on what the cerebrum is. So as I said, the cerebrum is a part of the brain that is most dominant when you look at it. It's made up of lots of different wrinkles, and these wrinkles are called gyri and sulci. So the top of the wrinkle, or the mountainous bit, is called the gyri, and then in between the little grooves we've got sulci. So gyri and sulci. And when you've got a really big sulci or a really big sulcus, you can see it's a deeper groove, and this one here is called a fissure, in particular a longitudinal fissure. So deep grooves or deep sulci are called fissures. Our gyri are the mountainous bits at the top, and our sulci are the grooves in between. What's the point of having all of these? Well, by having mountains and grooves, or gyri and sulci, we actually increase our surface area of the brain, allowing us to fit more information into a smaller space, that being the skull. By having this longitudinal fissure, we're really breaking the brain into 2 parts, left and a right side, and these sides are called hemispheres. Within each hemisphere, as we'll see in the next slide, it's broken into 5 lobes. So what are the lobes called? Well, we have a frontal lobe. This is the frontal lobe here. Frontal lobe, you can see it all the way around there. And although it's quite complex, so each area of the brain is quite complex, the main role that this frontal lobe performs are cognitive tasks and allows us to generate voluntary movements. So I've put here a Rubik's Cube, and that's to try and help you jog your memory, but you need to remember that this is a really gross oversimplification of what the brain functions as. At the back and top of the brain, we have what's called the parietal lobe. And this is involved in touch, sensation, and allows us to determine where our body is in space. So this is the parietal lobe there. We then have a temporal lobe. Our temporal lobe is this area here. It's involved in memory, and particularly in hearing and in language generation. And we have right at the back our occipital lobe, this area at the back here, which of course is involved in vision. That's 4 of the 5 lobes, and they're the 4 lobes that you can see from the outside. But if you were to pull back, as is the case in this diagram with these surgical instruments, if you were to pull back the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, you'd see what was called the insula. The insula lies deep to the temporal lobe. It's insulated by the temporal lobe, and in under here it's still an area of the cerebrum, and this particular area is involved in taste sensation. So we're going to look at each of these in a bit more detail in our next video, but I just want to bring your attention to the fact that the cerebrum is not only made up of what's on the outside, but there's also bits on the inside. So the cerebrum is actually made up of grey matter on the outside, in what's called the cerebral cortex, white matter in the middle, and then islands of grey matter more centrally. Let's talk about each of these. So here's our brain as we've just been talking about it. I'm going to take a little chunk out. When we take the chunk out, it looks like this. You'll see that the colours are still on the top, and they represent the cerebral cortex that we've just been talking about. Cerebral cortex, the outside of the brain, or the bark. This is a Latin word for bark. So the outside of the brain, the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is actually made up of this area here. And because when you cut that piece of brain out, it looks a bit grey, it's called the grey matter. What's grey matter made up of? If you cast your mind back to what a neuron looks like, we've got a cell body, a number of dendrites coming off that cell body, and these dendrites and cell bodies are what makes up that grey matter. But you'll also remember that the neuron has an axon, and that many of these axons have got myelin sheaths around them. and those myelin sheaths appear white. So the region underneath the grey matter is the white matter. So you can see over here the white matter contains myelinated axons. They're organised into tracks, which basically just allow information to get from one place to another. Because of these tracks, the white matter can communicate between different areas of the brain or different areas of the cortex, and also communicate between the brain and the central nervous system. As I said before, we've got two hemispheres within the brain, and information from one side of the body will go to the opposite hemisphere, but we still need the brain to be able to talk between the two hemispheres. So, axons from each area of the brain can cross over in an area here called the corpus callosum. It's also written over here. So the corpus callosum. It's a really important part of the brain which basically just connects the left and the right hemispheres. So if we were to drill a little bit further down into our brain, you'd see there are islands of grey matter. So we had our grey matter at the top, then our white matter, but embedded within the white matter are these islands of grey matter. And they're represented on this diagram here by these regions. These islands of grey matter are called basal nuclei. Basal nuclei. In old textbooks and people who have been taught years ago, they'll often incorrectly refer to them as basal ganglia, but they're basically referring to the same thing. So we're talking about basal nuclei. So basal nuclei, they work with the cortex, so the area right at the top, to start or stop movements and also monitor intensity. So we'll talk about this more as we talk about the generation of movement in our later videos.